Let's stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, I'll call to order the special workshop meeting for Morgan Township firehouse expansion on Tuesday, April 10th, 2018, 5 p.m. Chief Galloway, you want to start us off?
Yes, thank you for tonight's workshop at 5 p.m. I appreciate that. I've got an agenda there for both of you and Connie as well. I'm going to go through the beginning of it, and then I'll bring in our guest tonight. So the current status right now is I talked last week to Brad Rupert, the Chief Investment Officer for LCMB Bank, reference to obtaining a loan for the project. He included, and I just gave this to you here, this amortization schedule. He included that for a 10, 15, and 20-year amortization payment on a $500,000 loan. If you see at the bottom, he did them in semi-annual 2 times a year, so I kind of added at the bottom, did the round out figures, and then put the monthly figures on the top 3 categories, which was 10, 15, and 20 years. And I think we can come back and talk about that here in a few minutes. He also drove me to Dinsmore and Brenda Waymeyer, and did I say that right? Brenda Weimer, about getting a bond. So I got truly educated by her on a bond, and she's going to come up here in a few minutes and explain that on the bond side of it for governmental entities. So we'll let her come in just a few minutes. The proposed budget, the proposed payment for the project, we had talked originally out of the EMS account, and that was for several reasons we talked about, because we didn't think that because it was, quote, billing money, we didn't need to go through some of the process, which Jack Grove has obviously said now we do have to go through the whole processes since it's a government project. So that being said, Kai and I both looked at our Fund 2 2111, which is our fire levy. And that brings in an estimated about $420,000 a year on new growth. So my recommendation would be is when we get to this process of the payment back is that we move the payments to the fire levy, because the capital projects that will kick in for the new vehicles will not come in until 2020 to 2021 on those. And by then, it significantly has grown since we just received our tax dollars last week. B is completed the request for proposals for 2 additional architectural and engineering firms per Jack Grove to interview. Mark Shoemaker is here tonight as well, and we'll have him come up and speak from KZF Designs. And then C is a tentative timeline. I put in there tentative timelines. I know these are probably not going to be realistic or not, but I just put them in there, kind of give us some guide and some path on the project from April, from now present through possibly a breaking ground sometime in August or late summer. Any questions on any of that so far? Sorry. Okay. Then I would like to, I will tell you that I talked to Brenda in great length the other day, a true education on bonds. She has invited her tonight to kind of explain it in the process, and then also has some follow-up on some paperwork and some motions that both the trustees have to do, and then also with Connie as a fiscal officer. And also I put her bio up there for the 3 of you to take a look at as well. And without any questions from me, I'll let Brenda come up.
Okay, before we start, Brenda, I forgot to do a roll call, so Connie, if you could do a roll call.
Sure. Mr. Brucker.
Yes.
Mr. Kolb.
Yes.
And Mr. Updike will be here a little bit late, but he will be here later.
Thank you.
Brenda, I just have to ask you, did you just teach some classes at the LOGC in Columbus?
I did.
That's why you look familiar. Okay.
I did just present at the state
Okay.
auditors training session.
I think I have the notes right here, so.
Great, you are way ahead of the rest of everybody then. So as Connie heard at the auditor's training, governments have rules when they issue debt. Unlike you and I, we can go down to the bank and take out a loan for as much money as the bank will give us for whatever purpose we want, so long as the bank will loan us the money. Not so much for governments. There's a set of rules for every different type of governmental entity with respect to borrowing. And as a non-home rule township, you have this set of rules that you have to abide by when you're issuing debt. And so one of the rules is you don't really go to the bank and take out a commercial loan. There's a procedure you have to follow in order to issue debt. It has to be for a capital purpose, which the fire station would be. It has to be for a governmental purpose. Again, the fire station would be a governmental purpose. There are very few rare instances where you could potentially borrow for operating purposes, but we're not going to talk about that because they're very limited. So a capital project for a governmental purpose. And the reason that those are important for two reasons. One, because state law says that's what you have to do. But two, there's a benefit for a government issuing debt in that you get to issue debt that is tax exempt. And that means that the investor who buys it gets to deduct the interest earnings from their income, and they don't have to pay taxes on the interest earnings as income. So when we talk about there are rules, there are state law rules for debt issuance, and then there are IRS rules to make sure that the debt stays tax exempt to the investor. And we have to comply with both of those on top of all the fun and wonderful SEC rules. The Securities and Exchange Commission has all kinds of fun rules too. You're going to be exempt from most of the SEC rules, but not all of the SEC rules. So we'll go back to the state law. The good thing is for townships, more than a couple of years now, been doing this longer than I once was, they changed the township laws and expanded your ability to issue debt, particularly for fire purposes. So you can issue debt for a fire station, and the amount of that debt is sort of unrestricted. While there are limits on the amount of debt that you can issue for various other purposes, and a city has sort of a blanket formula for all their debt. No, the township formula is different for every type of project. There's a different rule for police equipment debt. There's a different rule for special assessment debt. There's a different rule for fire. There's a different rule for parks. So you have a different rule for every type of debt that you issue. For fire, there's one rule that says you're limited to a principal amount of debt equal to 2% of the township's assessed valuation. There's another rule that exempts you from that for certain kinds of fire debt, which this would fall into. So you don't have a direct debt limitation. Connie heard a lot about the direct debt limitations last month. There is still the constitutional indirect debt limitation. So while you can issue $500,000, which is what the chief indicated you're looking at for this particular project, and you don't have a state law direct debt issue with that amount of money, you still need to get a 10 mil certificate from the county auditor. This is the constitutional debt limit. The Constitution says that all overlapping subdivisions cannot issue more debt than would be required to pay back from the inside millage that is currently levied and collected by the county auditor. So the county auditor, the good news is they keep track of all that and do the calculation. And so if you proceed with this debt issuance, we will request the 10 mil certificate from the county auditor for you. They're accustomed to seeing these all the time, and we frequently request the 10 mil certificates from the county. So I don't anticipate it being a problem. I checked briefly on a database website that tries to keep track of people's 10 mil limitations, and there was no issue, but we will definitely need the county auditor to certify and verify that. So from a debt limit standpoint, there are rules. This particular financing shouldn't be a problem under any of the rules for the capacity. So you'd be allowed to issue debt. Now, I haven't seen the proposed amortization schedules that the chief has received from LCMB, but he's indicated 10, 15, and 20 years. And one of the things that we discussed on the phone was that you intend for the money to come from the fire levy, but it's a 5-year levy. So you'll be issuing what we refer to as general obligation debt. You'll be pledging the full faith and credit of the township and all legally available funds. So any of your general monies, not road and bridge monies because those are restricted. Certain other monies that are restricted can't be used. But any unrestricted legally available monies in addition to the fire levy is what you're really pledging. And why that's important to you is if you amortize this and enter into a bond issue that goes out beyond the final year of collection on that tax levy, and the tax levy doesn't get renewed for some reason, you're still responsible for the payments on that debt. So a lot of times they try to match up their amortization schedule to the term of a levy. You don't have to because you're issuing general obligation debt, but you have to be aware that you will have to make the payments from other available funds if something goes wrong with a levy renewal. Now, it could be, the levy doesn't get renewed, worst case scenario. It could be a gap. Something goes wrong at a certain election, it gets renewed at the next election, but you'll have a gap in collections potentially, depending on when it goes on the ballot and when it passes. So you have to be prepared for that based on what amortization schedule you select for the issue. It looks like if LCMB has provided you those various options, they're not concerned about the levy passage or your ability to repay the debt over a period of time longer than the current levy is in effect for. But you need to be aware of, what the legal ramifications are if you take out general obligation debt and the revenue source from which you hope to pay it goes away or changes some way. You're still responsible for that. If you should default on the debt, then the county auditor will reallocate the inside millage that is part of your current budget and pay the debt first before reallocating that. So it's not as simple as, we'll just walk away. That doesn't really happen in the general obligation context. So those are sort of the basics of, your rules and limitations. What's the process you have to undertake to issue debt? You have to pass an authorizing resolution, and we will draft that for you, should you engage us. The statutes require that the authorizing resolution have certain elements, the purpose, the term, the interest rate, or a maximum interest rate if you haven't actually finalized that with the bank, and certain other required elements. And so we'll draft that for you and make sure everything is in there. There are also various closing documents that will need to be prepared and executed by the board. You'll have to, the fiscal officer will sign what we refer to as a sunshine certificate stating that all discussions and meetings were open meetings in compliance with the public records and the sunshine laws. And then you will sign a SIG and no litigation certificate, which states that you are the actual elected officials and that the township is not currently being sued with respect to the project, the financing, or the revenue stream expected to pay back the financing. Then there are some tax documents, because we talked about it was tax exempt to the investor, so there's a stack of tax documents that go with the closing documents. The important thing to know about the tax documents is that you are certifying that you will spend the money quickly. The IRS got really annoyed back in the early 80s when interest rates were double digit and people were borrowing in the tax exempt market but not actually doing anything with the money. They were investing it in the taxable market and earning more than they were paying. So they were making money off of borrowing in one market and investing in another. And the IRS kind of went berserk. And hence the 1986 Tax Act, where they said, no, you can't do that anymore. Seems kind of silly to us today because interest rates have been so low for so long. It's not really feasible to do what they did in the early 80s, but it could change. So the IRS, as part of getting away from that abuse of the markets as they would deem it, has stated that if you borrow money, you have to have a legitimate project, and in order for them to sort of be certain you do, you have to spend the money within a 2-year time period. You have 3 years until they get really cranky, but ideally you're supposed to spend the money within a 2-year period. And so the tax documents that will be part of the closing certificates will contain certifications that say you understand that you have to spend the money within the time frame, you will spend the money, you reasonably expect to spend it within that time frame, and that if you don't spend it, you will pay arbitrage rebate back to the IRS. And what that means is, should you happen to have money that hasn't been spent after the 2-year mark, and you have it invested in such a way that you happen to be earning more than you're paying LCMB on the bonds, you'll give that difference to the IRS so that you're not making any money on the borrowed proceeds at a tax-exempt rate. So the tax docs are quite voluminous compared to the other closing documents, which are a couple of pages, but it boils down to you're going to comply. The other big issue, and this is more for the fiscal officer, with the tax docs is the IRS can come in and audit your bonds to make sure that you're in compliance with the IRS rules at any time during the life of the bond and for a period of 3 years after you've made your final payment on the bonds. So the most important thing to remember here from an audit perspective is that you need to keep all records for the bond and the construction project and the expenditure of the proceeds for 3 years after the bonds have been matured, regardless of what your normal records retention policy is. If your records retention policy says, 10 years or 7 years, and you do a 20-year bond, you got to keep those records for 23 years. You can't get rid of them in 10 years, even if your records retention policy says so. So that's just a little thing to keep in the back of your mind, that you have to have all of the records from day one for the entire time, because the IRS could come in at any time during the life of that bond and audit and request to see those. And that's the thing that sort of makes the IRS the crankiest, is when they go in to do an audit and the government says, well, we don't have those records anymore. And you don't like that very much.
Brenda, got one question. If you don't spend all of the money, who manages that arbitrage process? Is that the IRS that will manage that piece?
Not unless and until they come in and do an audit. So what happens is, if you haven't spent the money within the prescribed time period, you pick up the phone and call us, or Connie calls us and says, oh, by the way, we borrowed $500,000 and we have $25,000 left and the project is done. And we now talk about what are your options, because we need to get that money spent.
So you will be the arbitrator then?
Right, you'll call us and we'll talk about your options,
Okay.
and we'll make a decision about which one to do. If we deem, and then during the time while we're figuring out how to make the money be spent or redeem bonds and decrease your debt,
Yeah.
you'll have to, the records that you get from the bank showing how much interest you have, our tax rebate person will do the arbitrage calculation for you to figure out if you owe anything to the IRS. And then, so we can help you through that process. But, yeah, if at the end of the project you have money left, yeah, somebody needs to pick up the phone and call us, because then we need to talk about what your options are. Because depending on how much money is left, we have different options for what to do in that situation. One is you can use it to pay interest on the bonds for no more than 2 years. One is you might be able to add on another project to, you know, so say you scoped out the project and you're done with it, but you have this much money left. So, oh, hey, we'd like to do this with the extra money. Can we? And that kind of depends on what the we'd like to do is. You might be able to, in which case then the IRS will say it's been spent, so even if it wasn't part of the true original project. In other cases, you may have to pay down your debt and do an early call on a portion of the bonds and pay them off early. So there are options depending on the actual circumstances. So yes, if there is money left at the end of the project, or if for some reason the project gets delayed. There are some instances where if the project gets delayed and it's beyond your control, the IRS will give you more time without kicking in the arbitrage rules. For instance, I had a client who had a project going on, and you know, somebody came across an endangered species on the site, which you know brings a great screeching halt to everything for years while the EPA figures out whether or not they can actually proceed. And the IRS throws up their hands and says, you can't do anything about the EPA, and the IRS can't do anything about the EPA, so we're just going to put you in limbo for a while. But if it's, you know, just because, well, you know, it's rained a lot, the architects are behind, or the construction people are behind because they got 6 other jobs and they didn't prioritize ours, the IRS doesn't really care about that. You get the money spent. They are willing to, you know, be reasonable for big things that are way beyond your control. Tornado comes through and wipes everything out, they will make some leniency exceptions. But so if you're getting close to your period and the project gets delayed, we need to talk. If you have money left over, we need to talk. And then we will walk through options at that time for how best to keep the bonds tax exempt, because what you really want is to protect your investor. The penalty is not really to you from the IRS so much as it is to the investor, but if the investor incurs a penalty, they're going to come back to you. We will prepare the closing documents, and then the actual bond itself that will be executed by the officials and delivered to LC&B. We will make arrangements for closing with LC&B and deliver all of the executed documents to them, and then they will fund according to your instructions. And I think the chief indicated you have accounts at LC&B, so Connie will just tell them which account to put it into, and then on the day of closing, we'll just verify with Connie that LC&B has actually funded into their account the proper amount of money. Then we'll prepare a complete transcript for you of all documents, because the state auditors will want to see that at some point when they come in to do your audit. So we'll prepare a transcript and deliver a transcript to you and to the bank and we'll keep a set in our records in case there are questions that arise at a later date. So this was sort of a brief overview of debt. So do you guys have other questions about the debt, the process, our role?
Your role, you're part of the project. How's that?
Okay.
How do you figure a cost on that?
Okay. I work
Is it
for
percentage?
you. I work for the township. I do not work for the bank. Okay. Even though, Brad gave my name out, I work for a lot of governmental entities who do business with the bank. So Brad and I see each other on a regular basis. But you are my client should you choose to engage us. And I did bring an engagement letter for you. I also brought a conflict waiver because while I work for you and not the bank, we are now part of a big law firm. We used to be, some of you may remember the name Peck, Schaefer and Williams. We were a small bond-only firm, and we were acquired, merged into Dinsmore about 4.5 years ago. So Dinsmore's a big firm. They have other attorneys who do work for LC&B unrelated to this bond transaction or any other bond transaction, but under the legal ethics rules, it presents sort of a quasi-conflict. So you have to waive the conflict to allow me to work for you, notwithstanding that someone else at the firm might be doing other unrelated work for the bank. So I've brought a conflict waiver and an engagement letter. Should you engage us, I did a fee quote for this transaction. Our fee would be $3,250. Now, in addition to preparing all of the paperwork that we discussed, what we're really doing for that money is giving an opinion to you and the bank. The bank will not close the bonds without a legal opinion that says two things they're looking at in the opinion. One, the bonds are valid, and you have the legal authority to issue the bonds and to repay the bonds. And the second thing they're looking for is our opinion that says those bonds are tax exempt, and so they can deduct the interest on those. And we are liable for our opinion and anything that goes wrong with the bonds for the life of the bonds. So our fee includes a component for the actual document work, and then an opinion fee is the other part of our fee. So for transaction of this nature and this size, that would be our fee on this transaction.
So explain a little more, I guess the bank issues us the money, but there are investors then that.
Well, the bank is
purchase-
the investor in
So
this
that is-
case.
there
The bank is
it's
the
not like a
investor.
municipal or a
You could
tax-free
do,
bond,
well, it is but the bank's
but
the
to
only
bank,
buyer.
It's not to individual investors.
You have the option of issuing debt and selling it in a variety of ways. So the way that's being discussed right now is what we refer to as sort of a private placement or a direct placement with a bank. So the bank is the only investor.
Okay, got it.
The other option is to engage an underwriter who will actually sell pieces of the bond instead of the whole bond to one bank/investor. They'll sell pieces of the bond to a variety of potential investors. Individual investors, institutional investors, life insurance companies, et cetera, mutual funds, or Joe Smith, or, So you can do an underwritten deal. On a $500,000 bond issue, it's a little small to attract the attention of underwriters, particularly if we're going to stretch it out over an extended period of time. The amount that matures each year gets smaller and smaller, and the underwriters are like, this is going to be hard to place in that market. But the banks, this is what they're looking for in terms of size and so forth. So, yes, when I say investor in this particular case, there will be one investor. Now, these bonds are not restricted as some types of financings are. In other words, we will not restrict Lebanon Citizens' ability to actually sell that bond to someone else. So Lebanon Citizens will buy it. They don't intend to sell that investment to someone else, but let's just say you chose the 20-year amortization. 10 years from now, Lebanon Citizens could decide, they're not going to be in the banking business anymore, and they could start selling off assets and investments, and they may sell this bond to some other bank or investor, and the terms of this particular financing don't prohibit them from doing that, but their initial intent is they're going to keep it until maturity, and they've done this numerous times before, and I'm not aware that they've actually ever, they don't even have to go out of business to sell. They could, need cash for something, but they've never sold one of the bonds that we've been involved in that they have purchased, which doesn't mean they can't, but they haven't in the past.
So if we took a 20-year amortization, is there any prepayment penalty, or can you not prepay it?
That's going to depend on your negotiations with the bank. So if you want the ability to prepay, we need to talk to the bank about what the prepayment provisions could be. As I alluded to earlier, interest rates have been really low for a number of years. So a lot of loans for the last 10 years have been done with call provisions with no prepayment penalties. Back in, when I started in this business a while ago, interest rates were a little higher. You sometimes had to pay a 2% premium to prepay early, or a 1% premium to prepay early. And oftentimes that premium would go away over time. So if you prepaid in the first 5 years, you had to pay a premium. If you didn't prepay until you're 15 on a 20, there wasn't any premium at that point. The industry standard for municipal debt is a 10-year call protection period where you either can't prepay for the first 10 years or you have to pay a premium during that time period. And generally, you don't pay a premium to call or prepay 10 years out. But you can have that discussion with the bank. Some banks are like, yeah, you can prepay at any time, no penalty, we don't care. Other banks have different rules. Lebanon Citizens is generally pretty workable, so if you want the ability to prepay, that's something that I'll need to know so that I can talk to Brad about it and we can make sure to put the right language in the bonds that works for you and works for the bank, so that is a negotiable term.
Okay.
Did they give you, have we talked any interest rates, or will that be later?
That's-
I have not, but the chief may have.
All right, got it.
From the bank transfer.
Yeah, the bank will give you interest rates, and at what point those rates are preliminary and at what point they lock them in kind of depends on when you're really going to issue the debt.
How recent was this amortization table?
Last week.
Yeah.
Okay. Last week. Gave it to us last
Wednesday.
20-year, 30-year, and a 40-year.
10, 20, 10,
No, 10.
10,
15, and 20.
12, 15, 20.
Because most bonds are set up,
Looking at
thank
the
you,
payment.
on a semi-annual, most municipal bonds are set up to pay interest semi-annually and principal annually. But if you're doing a private placement with a bank, you can structure it to do semi-annual principal and interest, annual principal and interest, monthly payments, quarterly, if you want a particular payment scenario, we can talk to the bank about that on a private placement. If you were going, to the investing market through an underwriter, it's pretty much one principal payment and 2 interest payments a year. So it looks like he has set this up for 2 principal and interest payments, semi-annual principal and interest payments each year. If you want something different, we can certainly talk to them about that.
So is that the next step to secure financing before we choose an architect? Should we have the funding basically
Okay,
in hand?
so the rules are, you can't sign contracts until you have the funds in hand
Right.
or in the process of collection. You may have money in the bank to sign the architect's contract. Even if you don't intend to use it, you may have money that you can at least sign the contract, because if push came to shove, you could pay the architect from that. So you may not have to have the bonds issued by the time you sign the architect's contract. My guess is you're gonna want the money in place before you sign the construction contracts. But whether or not you have money in hand before you sign the architect's contract sort of depends on you and your current fiscal status and your budget. So if you want the money in hand before you sign any contracts, then yeah, we've got to put this on a kind of a fast track. If you don't need money on hand until you actually sign the construction contracts, we've got a little time to get through the process.
Here's where I'm coming from is we're just throwing 500,000 out there. We're not.
We don't really know what the number
Right.
is.
Till we get an architect, get a solid set of plans that we can get,
Right.
construction to start bidding on it.
And that is usually how people work it. They usually hire the architect, and you can do this a couple of ways. One, if you have the money in the bank, you can go ahead and sign the architect's contract. If you have to make payments to the architect, because they're professional services and they're treated differently for IRS purposes, you can issue the bonds and then put the money back into the account from the bonds that you paid the architect, and then have the rest of it available for actual construction. So you can do what we call reimburse yourself for professional fees. Now, you can't actually start spending construction dollars without a whole other process, because the IRS doesn't like you to borrow for a project that's already done. That's another one of their little quirks. So if you're just paying professional fees, architects, engineers, lawyers, you can take money on hand that you don't really intend to use long-term for that purpose, pay those bills, and once you issue the debt, put that money back into that fund from the bond proceeds. But the same rules don't apply for actual construction expenditures. We gotta have the bonds in place, or we have to pass a whole bunch of other resolutions to make the IRS happy before we spend money that isn't bond proceeds that we intend to put back from bond proceeds for hard construction costs. So timing, in this case, if the 500,000 is not, a firm number, you've got two concerns. One, if 500,000 is too much, so let's say bids come in at 400 and you borrowed 500, oh geez, well, we've just told the IRS we're gonna spend 500,000 and we're not gonna be able to spend that. Now we're gonna have to redeem bonds. What do our redemption provisions look like? Do we have to pay a penalty? We shouldn't have borrowed this much money. Or,
The other hand.
right, you're $100,000 short, and now you gotta go back and borrow some more money, or you gotta come up with cash to pay the balance. So, in our arena, there are kind of two options. One is to kind of wait as long as possible before you actually borrow the money, so that you have better information about how much you need to borrow. In some cases, on really large projects that are gonna take a while to get done, and we all know there are those little annoying things called change orders that change the budget. They'll do what we refer to as short-term interim financing, a note. They'll do a one-year financing. So they'll borrow as much as they think they need for the project, and then they'll get through construction, and they'll convert the note financing into a bond at that point in time, with the ability to either add more to the debt or reduce the debt if they had money left over. That puts you at sort of interest rate risk in some environments, because we're now, they keep telling us, in the rising interest rate environment that they've been predicting for the last 3 years. But, so you can lock in the long-term bond rates this summer, or you could do a one-year financing, get money, see how the construction project goes, then refinance that 1 year before its maturity date next summer, but the rates may or may not be similar next summer. When you
Question,
go, yep.
with the architect, if we pay that out of pocket, we still gotta go back and put that in the loan for the project?
You don't have to. If you already have,
Pay ourselves back.
We get-
if you have money in a fund that is available to pay them, and you don't want it to be part of your borrowed cost, you can just write them a check and be done.
So the architect can be done, and then we just borrow for the construction?
Absolutely. You don't have to
Okay,
include the.
'cause the way you said that, I
I'm
thought
sorry.
we gotta go back in and add that in.
No, I was saying if you
And-
needed the money, if you were expecting to pay the architect from the bond proceeds, but you weren't ready to issue the bonds yet,
I
you
just
could
wanna
pay
make
them
sure
from
we
some
didn't have
other.
to have that in there for IRS reasons or something?
No, if you, in
Yes.
your budgeting process, have decided that you want to pay cash for a part of the project, and, you know, that's architects, engineers, and/or some other components of the project, you don't have to borrow for 100% of the project cost. You determine how much you want to borrow for a project. So if the project was $750,000 and you wanted to limit your borrowing to 500, you can do that. You can pay cash for a portion of your project, and it's solely up to you how much and for what portions of the project you use the cash towards. I was just trying to relay that if you didn't have any cash set aside for this project, but you had cash balances, you could use them but replenish those cash balances that you might need for other purposes. But if you have set money aside in your budget to pay a portion of this project in cash, yeah, by all means,
Okay.
pay whatever you can with the money that's there before you borrow money.
All right,
Okay.
just double check.
Anybody else?
There are lots of issues and nuance.
I'm sure tonight about 11 o'clock, my brain will start kicking in and.
I am going to leave these with you. This is the conflict waiver
Okay.
that you'll want to just look at, and then it's addressed to the chief, but anybody can sign this. The board president or the chief can sign. This is the one regarding our relationship with LCND.
Great.
Okay.
And so just one copy of that, and you can scan that back to us.
You know, is the only thing that could ever really go wrong is if you cannot pass a levy to meet your payment obligations. Everything else seems very
Well,
process, cut and
It's not
dried.
the only thing that can go wrong, because as we all saw in '08, assessed valuations went way down after the recession in '08. So even if the levy passes again, the amount of money that you're currently getting from it could change. Sometimes it goes up, sometimes it goes down. It's fairly constant because of the way that reduction factors and tax levies work. But as we all found out after '08, it goes down faster than it goes up as a result of changes in AB.
And once it
So
goes down, it will not go back up.
it can, but it goes up much slower than it went down.
But the small amount that we're looking at, we're not exposing ourselves too greatly on this, I
Right.
don't think.
Exactly,
Okay,
but there's always risk with this. There's always risk.
okay.
Several years ago, some counties up north experienced devastating flooding, and their ABs
Natural
plummeted
disaster
for
happens.
years. Their
You're in trouble.
they had some issues up there. They had some issues, so it's always a risk. The risks are usually minimal, but
Or manageable.
Okay.
right, right, but you have to be aware of it. Okay, the other thing that I'm going to leave with you are 2 copies. What am I saying? I want to see it. Do I need to sign these? I need to sign these.
Here's a pen right here.
Thank you. 2 copies of the engagement letter. One for your files, and then one if you would mail that one back to us. You guys decide to sign that after we come to review it. Now, this engagement letter is set up for an ongoing relationship, even though, as Jeff and I were discussing earlier, you're not frequent issuers. I was telling him I worked for the township back in '05, we did a small borrowing for some real estate acquisition back in '05. Still had paper back then. get that. I'll give you time to look at it as opposed to just signing it on the spot because I didn't send it to anybody
Right.
electronically beforehand. And if anybody has any questions, just email me.
So are you a division or is Dinsmore Shoals
Yeah,
a division of you?
is kind of gone. It's Dinsmore.
Din-
I'll give you one.
Oh, okay, right, okay.
Dinsmore Shoals has been around for 100 and, yeah, since I didn't grow up in Dinsmore, I've kind of not as familiar with their facts. Over 100 years. Not quite as old as Peck Schaefer was, but close to it before the merger. So Dinsmore's been around for 100 years. They're a multi-line firm. Peck Schaefer was just bonds. That's all we did was bond work. So Peck Schaefer is kind of gone. We've been subsumed into Dinsmore, and so it's just Dinsmore and Shoal now. Right after the merger, it was sort of Peck Schaefer, a division of Dinsmore during the transition period, but we're at the transition period at this point.
Okay, so then once, if we do the engagement letter, and I get that back to you, and then you'll prepare the resolution that we need to pass to,
Well, yes, I will, but how quickly you want it kind of depends, as you said. Do you want to be issuing debt immediately
Okay.
if you don't know how much you want?
sure,
Or do you want to get further down the process? Jeff and I talked about, I'm gonna look at my notes. We talked about one possibility was we could potentially have everything ready for a $500,000 issue for your April 24th meeting. He thought that might be too early for you, that you might not really know how much you want or what direction you were going. And so we talked about the first meeting in May, which, if I recall right, was on election night, so wasn't sure what date that would be. Again, that may or may not be enough time for you to solidify. You might want to push it out further.
So how long does it take to prepare this?
Yeah. Part of it depends on what else we have going on, and whether we have everything we need from the bank. What we need to know in order to prepare the documents is how much money. We need to know what payment schedule, 10 years, 15, 20. We need to know semi-annual payments, annual payments, semi-annual interest, annual principal. We also need to have the actual amortization schedule, although we can run an amortization schedule if Brad hasn't once we figure out what it is. We need to know the interest rate. So Brad has to determine the interest rate, and then we have to know that that is acceptable to you and that you want to move forward. And then we can prepare the documents. Now, you can adopt the authorizing resolution if we get into sort of a time crunch. We can get the authorizing resolution prepared for you, which you can adopt, and then we can follow up with the closing documents at a later time and get those to you to be executed prior to closing. If we have enough time, we can get the resolution to you and the closing documents at the same time. You don't have to sign the closing documents during an actual meeting. You just have to pass the resolution at a meeting, which authorizes you then to sign the closing documents later. It's convenient for you if we get you everything all at once, but depending on, you know, when other information becomes available and when meetings are scheduled, that may or may not be possible. And remember also I said we have to request a 10 mil certificate from the county. So we can prepare a resolution, but we can't close until we get that certificate from the county. Generally, we don't have any problem getting those within 2 weeks or less. Sometimes they'll turn them around really quickly. It partly depends on how busy they are and what, you know, if it's budget season or tax levy season, it takes them a little longer. During some parts of the year, we get them back a lot quicker, but getting it within a 2 week period has never been an issue for Butler County. They, as I said, they see these all the time,
So
unfortunately.
your normal process, are we looking 3 weeks typical turnaround on an average?
Yeah, we tell people to expect about 30 days for a private placement once you are ready to pull the trigger and start solidifying the details.
Okay.
Okay, well, it kind of depends on getting the architect in place, get the drawings submitted out for, construction contractors to bid on, and get the bid packages, review them, and so we were shooting for June to get that done, then we should be able to have everything in hand by the end of July.
Right, so then a financing late summer.
Yeah.
As opposed to early, which,
Then that would keep us on track to break ground August, September timeframe. Oh, okay.
sure.
Oh, no.
Well, I'll stick around in case after
Well,
you
we're
hear
still
from
in
him,
winter in
you have
April,
other
so
questions.
we should be in summer in December.
Well, that's what I'm thinking. That's what I'm thinking.
Thank you very much.
Next.
Thank you, Brenda.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so next I'm going to introduce and bring up Mark Shoemaker from KZF Designs. I met Mark at the OTA conference, talked at great length with him and another member from his firm. I liked that in their presentation on their board there, they had a lot of fire stations and things that related to emergency and public safety buildings. I believe a couple of you trustees may have also talked to the firm while you were at the OTA conference. Mark came and visited me about 3 weeks ago. He was very patient with me because that's the night we were up all night with a fire and then had the near fatality wreck on Lehigh, so I was pretty dragging. But we walked through the whole area. I explained the whole project to him, what we had. And then the other thing I would thank Mark publicly is he's the one that brought to my attention about the ORC and the smaller project and the under $50,000, which is what we then asked Jack Grove for that opinion of interview versus having to go through the whole bid process. So with that, I will bring in Mark Shoemaker up and let him explain his design firm and what some of the things he thinks about the project, and then you have your questions.
Pass out some information, and Connie, I'll give you my copies.
Oh, that's fine.
We can
As long
share.
as I can share with Tom, that's fine. They're the ones that are gonna be doing this part.
I should have made 6 copies. Thank you, sir. Thanks, Mark.
I think when I met with Chief at the OTA conference and then following up a couple weeks ago when I came out here, my understanding is the direction you're planning to go with the project is design-build project. Select a contractor that you can work with to build the project. And the reason I pointed out, and I sent some information to Chief, I actually did this last week again with another small fire department up in northern Ohio, trying to help them understand, as I did with Chief, what that process is and what the state requires townships to do. So my little presentation tonight is really geared towards trying to help you understand what that process is and what drives that, which is basically the state of Ohio process. Just back up a little bit here real quick, a little bit more about myself and KZF Design. KZF Design was actually in a good position when Ohio construction reform was passed, I guess about 6 years ago, which allowed design-build as a process in the state of Ohio. Prior to that time, you had to hire an architect, design a building, put it out for public bid. With Ohio construction reform, it opened the door to construction manager-led projects or construction manager at risk, as well as design-build projects for townships and small municipalities, as well as state projects and universities. KZF was in a good position for that because KZF had done a lot of design-build work over the years for the federal government, both as a design-build, as a team member with a design-build contractor, but also as a criteria architect. Criteria architect being the one that really establishes the criteria for the project that it then is bid on by the design builders. I've been with KZF for 4 years now, and in that time I've done about 8 or 9 design-build projects as a criteria architect. Most of those, all except for one, are fire station projects. I've got about 20 years of experience designing fire stations over the last, in terms of my career. most as a design architect or project manager on projects all over the country. I think there's about 40 or 50 fire stations I've been involved in around the country as the architect of record or as a design consultant. So when I came to KZF, that was about the time that everything was ramping up with design build in Ohio. KZF had already been a criteria architect on one fire station in Deerfield Township. They were criteria architect for the new fire headquarters. Actually, one of the first projects I did at KZF was a criteria architect for Deerfield Township's public works facility, which was built where the old fire station was. The first fire station project that I did as a criteria architect at KZF was Harlan Township, basically adding 50-foot length to their existing apparatus bays. $400,000 project, very small project, a lot of similarities to what you're doing here. I'm currently working with Hamilton Township in Warren County on a $4.5 million fire station as criteria architect. We're actually going through the RFQ process for design builders right now. And just real quick wrap up all this, right now in Madison Township, in Franklin County, and Goshen Township, again, Warren County, we've got 2 fire stations where I'm criteria architect, along with KZF's criteria architect. Those are projects that are wrapping up sometime, probably be doing punch list on those projects at the end of this month. So I've got a lot of personal experience on fire stations and developed over the last 4 years a lot of experience on the design build criteria architect process as well. What I put together a couple years ago was this chart that kind of graphically describes the process. And just like there's certain things you have to follow from state rules in terms of hiring a criteria architect or an architect for any type of project, there's a certain process you have to go through to select a design builder for a public project like yours. And they call it best value selection, but it requires that you hire a criteria architect. The state law states that the criteria architect cannot be the designer of record. In other words, the criteria architect cannot team with one of the design builders to be your architect of record. So automatically you end up with 2 architects on a project when you're going the design build route in the state of Ohio. The criteria architect is selected. You're going through that process right now. Once the criteria architect is brought on board, then you can begin the process of selecting the design builder. And that is a 2-step process. And hopefully what I've put together here helps explain this, but basically you put an RFQ out for design builders, you describe in general what the project is, you issue an RFQ, place a legal notice in the paper, put it on a township website, combination of things. You get qualifications or submittals back from design builders. Then you make a selection based on, not a selection, but a short list of who you feel of the people who have submitted are most qualified. Typically you shortlist 3 design build teams. Then you issue to the 3 shortlisted design builders the criteria documents and the request for proposal. It's a package that's put together, and I have a sample with me that I can share with you for Goshen Township. That package goes to the 3 selected, shortlisted design builders, and then they take the time to go through and prepare proposals based on the criteria documents. Now, a lot of times, in historically, the way it was set up, you would actually then get preliminary guaranteed maximum prices from those design builders as part of their submittal, and then you would evaluate based on qualifications as well as their price, who was best qualified, who was in the best interest of the township to move forward with the project, and you would select the one design builder. At that point in time, then they proceed with their architect to complete the final construction documents, get building permits, and start construction. In a nutshell, there's a period of time it takes to do all this. And the schedule I gave you there shows a typical time frame of about 20 weeks, somewhere around 19 to 20 weeks to go through that whole process once you've hired the criteria architect. So you're looking at a period of time to go through that process. Now, a project like yours, you can shorten that. But there's a certain amount of time, there's limitation, there's a certain amount of time that you have to do the legal notice and the legal ad for the design builders, for them to submit statements of qualifications. That's usually at least 3 weeks. Right now with Hamilton Township, it was advertised March 30th, and their qualifications are due on May 1st. And there's a couple of weeks for you to review the submitted qualifications and make a determination based on scoring on who the 3 most qualified are. And then at that point in time, usually that takes a couple of weeks, and then you issue that RFP criteria document to those design builders.
Who does the scoring?
You do that.
Okay.
You do that. I cannot. I don't think I'm allowed to actually score, but it's usually the township trustees along with the fire chief, or if it's a larger township, they may put together a selection committee. It varies. I've seen it vary all over the place. Usually the trustees are involved in that. Once you've made your selection on design builder, then they proceed with the final design of the project. And that can, on a relatively simple project like this, it may take a couple of months to get those permit documents done, and then they issue for permits and get permits, and you can start construction. On a more complicated project, it may take 6 or 8 months. With a design builder, though, there are ways you can expedite that process. At a certain point with that design builder, you will establish a guaranteed maximum price. We typically don't ask for that preliminary GMP at the time they submit their their RFP proposal. We typically ask for what we call pre-construction phase services. That's the services. That's their fee to complete the final design, and construction documents go for permit. At a certain point during the development of those construction documents, usually as they're completing design and going into the construction documents, we'll ask for that they establish the GMP at that point. There's a contingency that they build into their fee that's identified, so that knowing that the construction documents aren't 100% complete, there may be some items out there that are covered by the contingency, so that once they start construction, they don't exceed that guaranteed maximum price. But what it does give you some control. One of the advantages of working with a design builder, you've made a selection based on qualifications, unlike if you design a building, put it out for bid, and you hire the low bid contractor. There's you don't know for sure who you're getting unless you've happened to have worked with that contractor in the past.
So you choose that
You're making
design build contractor, not based on money. There's no money
It may
factor.
factor into it, but it's one of the points that you're evaluating. You're evaluating qualifications. You're evaluating their approach.
Okay.
Sometimes you may even Delhi Township. Part of the reason they selected the team that they did, they liked the design that team came up with, and so based on a combination of price, pre-construction phase fee, and what they proposed, and I think maybe even their schedule was a little bit more advantageous to the township, they made the selection of that particular design builder. Well, I would work with you to determine, not only in the RFQ process, but also the RFP process, to establish the score sheet, to determine what are the qualifications. A project like yours, you don't necessarily need to have a contractor who's built a fire station, because you're looking at basically building living quarters. What you're building there is no different, not a whole lot different than building a house. There are some nuances that you have to meet. You're not going to look for a residential architect probably to do that. But you don't have to have someone who's done 15 fire stations to be able to do that project. So the score sheet I typically do, that I have right now with Hamilton Township, that stresses a lot of emphasis on projects of a $5 to $10 million size. How many fire stations have you done? I would work with you and probably your attorney to determine what is the best way to handle this score sheet. One of the things too, one of the reasons we don't ask for a preliminary GMP in this market where contractors are busy, for them to submit a preliminary GMP at the time that they submit their proposal means they gotta spend a lot of time, along with their architect, to put together enough information to go out to sub-bidders to get pricing to establish that GMP. It's not final bids, but at least get some estimates. And what we have found right now in this construction market, people are so busy that they don't want to spend the time to do that on a project where they only have 1/3 of a chance to get it, to spend several hundred hours. Plus, what we're finding is the sub-trades, the electrical contractors, plumbing, masonry, whoever, they're not even wanting to put the time in to even submit an estimate to the design builders. So we've had a hard time getting good GMP numbers. One of the first questions I get from contractors anymore when we put an RFQ out is, are we going to have to submit a preliminary GMP if we get shortlisted and go through the RFP process? Because if they find out we're going to be asking for that, which we haven't for the last couple of years, if we ask for that, they're not going to submit on the project most times, especially on a really small project like this. My role as the criteria architect is to assist you all the way through that process. Typically, I handle issuing the statements or the RFQs once the legal notice goes out. I manage all that process for you. If there's any addenda that have to go out. And then while we're going through that process, and this is what this sheet is intended to show, is it's not a linear process. There's a lot of stuff going on at the same time. We're developing the criteria documents at the same time that we're going through that selection process. One of the things we do right up front to be able to get a legal notice out is your project's fairly well defined what you're doing here. A lot of times we have to go through a full programming exercise to determine what the needs are. We don't have to do that on this project, but we will need to meet with your legal counsel to coordinate putting the RFQ document together that goes out. We post a legal notice, and anybody who's interested contacts me, and I issue the actual RFQ document to them that spells out what they have to submit. That way we can keep track of who has the RFQ, and if there's any addenda, if we have to extend a date or something like that, we know who has the document. We get that sent out to them. And the other thing, like I said, trying to establish and figure out what is the best score sheet to put together. The other thing that we need assistance with your legal counsel on is the contract documents themselves. The state of Ohio has a set of documents that they've developed for their design build projects, but they tend to be pretty ponderous. They're a lot more involved than what is really required here. Most projects I've been involved in, working with the township or the client's attorney, we typically use either the AIA contract documents or the Design Build Institute contract documents. They have to be modified to meet certain criteria in the state law, but we typically use the modified AIA documents. So that's, again, something I'd be working with your attorney to make sure all that's put together, because that document is what is ultimately then submitted or issued along with the criteria documents.
So is there another option besides the design build? I mean, where you design the building and then?
That's the other option you have.
It just seems like we're redundant here. You're designing it,
Right.
then the contractor's bringing in their architect?
Yeah, well, and I'm not really designing it. I'll show you an example.
Is that in your scope of work, though? You can design it?
It can be there.
Okay.
And one of the issues here, though, is you don't know what the price is going to be until you actually put it out and get the bids. And you don't know, you've got a little bit less control on who the contractor is going to be at that point. Because now you put it out there. If you go to the traditional design bid build route, you know, we do an estimate. We can hire a cost estimator, give us very detailed estimates, but you really don't know until you put it out on the street. And then you get the bids in, and if you only got 2 or 3 people bid on it, and the prices may vary, you just don't know. If you go with the low bidder, it may or may not be the person that, the firm that you want.
We had that happen to us on George Road. The first one went way high.
Yeah.
Because we only got one person bidding.
Yeah. So there are advantages and disadvantages. The the advantage, one of the big advantages of the design build route is you do have a little bit more control on who you ultimately hire to build the project, but it does take a little bit longer to get there. That's probably the biggest disadvantage. In fact, I think I mentioned in my email, the OFCC manual right in the very front says you can save time and save money by going design build. That's not necessarily the case, and it actually takes a little bit longer because of the two-step process you have to go through. We try to shorten it as much as possible by doing a lot of these steps at the same time. And again, with this project being a little bit simpler, we don't have a whole lot of time on, or a whole lot of flexibility on the RFQ that when we issue the legal notice. That's always going to be a 3 to 4 week time frame. And the way we design this is the criteria documents are being finalized about the same time that you've made the selection on the design builder. In a project that's fairly simple like this, you can probably shorten the amount of time that you ask them to get their proposals back. If we were asking for a preliminary GMP and this was a project like Delhi Township, it was $3.5 million, they had about a 2.5 to 3 month time frame to get their design proposals put together. In the course of doing that, we had a couple of preliminary meetings where they could come in and actually present some preliminary designs and get feedback from the trustees. So it took 2.5 to 3 months just to get the GMP. Again, this project being a lot simpler, you can probably tighten that up to a month, month and a half, especially if you're not asking for the GMP. So this 19 to 21 week time frame can probably be shortened up maybe to 14, 15 weeks. I'd have to really look at that and analyze it. But also, a lot of times the schedule is put together based on, you see on here, there's a trustee meeting. We usually work these out, time these things, the decisions around trustee meetings. Now, a lot of times you can have a special trustee meeting and make a final decision on something, but typically we try to work these out relative to trustee meetings. So you can shorten this whole time frame up, but to be breaking ground in July or August that's a challenge. But honestly, that'd be a challenge even if you're hiring an architect and doing a traditional process.
Maybe spring, chief.
Yeah. So and I can put a little more detailed schedule, but this is the kind of typical schedule that I've seen on most projects, unless it's like Hamilton Township, everything got put on hold for 3 or 4 months while they went through some political changes. But usually this schedule is held fairly true. One thing I wish I had looked at, or I didn't think earlier today to look at Harlan Township and see how long that process took, but it wasn't a whole lot shorter than this. I think that one could have been a little bit shorter, but it wasn't. Goshen Township, we tightened the schedule up maybe 3 or 4 weeks. Their project's $1.5 million fire station is relatively small and simple. And real quick, the documents that we put together, and we don't put together a set of working drawings, plans, and specifications. Our deliverable, what goes to the contractors, is a manual like this. It has section 1 is the request for proposal, outlines, describes the building, general requirements for them to put a proposal together, includes a sample of the contract. In this case, I think it was a DBIA contract. I think it was DBIA. So it has all the contractual information in it. This was DBIA, Design Build Institute. Again, this was coordinated with the township attorney. The second part of the manual is what we call the narratives. This is where it really describes the project, describes what the building is supposed to look like, what it's going to be built out of, general description of mechanical systems, electrical systems. And again, for this project, be very simple type description of each room, restrooms, dormitories, your day room, meeting space as far as what the finishes are gonna be, size of the space, what equipment needs to go into the room. Typically, a lot of times we include a room diagram, but in the case of this project, I think would be the same as yours, we actually did a preliminary floor plan of the building. Again, from the standpoint of trying to make it simpler and more attractive to the design builders, that they weren't gonna have to come in and design the building from scratch. Chief's already got some ideas of how he wants to lay the building out. So what we would do on your project is the same thing we did with Goshen Township, very simple floor plan that shows what the building is gonna look like. It's not a construction document, but it lays it out and it's pretty simple. On this project, as we went through the design process with the contractor, and they got preliminary pricing, we had to tighten the building up. And so I worked with the design build architect to come up with alternatives on the plan. And we basically cut about 15 feet out of the plan, had to eliminate the half bay, so they ended up with 2 bays. But again, they were able to work through that process without going through the final design of the project and then have to scrap everything and spend a lot of time and effort going back to kind of redesign and rebid the project. It maybe added 2 weeks to the overall project, but at least that, again, that was one of the advantages of this process. They were able to do that working directly with the contractor that they had selected to get it to the point that they needed. We typically do some outline specifications for the project, include that again reinforces the narratives and describes the type of systems and equipment, you know, floor set toilets versus wall-hung toilets, you know, simple things like that, but establishes some of the quality of the project. And then finally, at the end, there's certain things that we include at the end. In a case where it's a new building on a site, the site survey, typically we have a geotechnical report that goes into this appendix, but it's just supplemental information that ultimately the design builder is going to need as they move forward once they get the project. So it's I think it's helpful to see this because it's sometimes people expect that we're going to be doing plans and elevations, things like that. We really don't do that. We're trying to basically, we're doing exactly what it says, our criteria for the project. So we work with the chief and yourselves to establish what the room sizes are going to be, dormitories, you know, are they going to have lockers inside the dorm or in a locker alcove outside the dorm? A lot of that kind of stuff goes in here to describe the project so that once the design builders come on board, they're all, you know, in looking at evaluating the project, they're all looking at the same thing. I've seen RFQs that went out, or RFPs for that matter, that was basically two sheets of paper that described a list of rooms and sizes of rooms, and that was it. And you put it out there, and the design builders look at that. So now what, you know, what do I do with this? Is it going to be a masonry building or is it going to be a pole barn? You got to establish some criteria so that everybody's looking at the same thing. And again, I've done everything from masonry buildings, and I've done a post frame fire station. Bloom Township up in Fairfield County, up near Columbus. That was a post frame building, probably very similar to what you have here. And again, we just established that criteria and went with it on that project. And it was one of the things we learned. We asked for a preliminary GMP, shortlisted 3 design builders, and on the day that proposals were due, we only got 1 submittal. And it was thrown out because when they had the interview, there were some things that were left out. The price was high, and they ultimately hired us to do the final design, put it out for bid. And ironically, on that one, when it bid out, they got the contractor they were looking for in the first place. But it doesn't always work out that way. So there's a lot of stuff. Hopefully this is helpful because it shows there's a lot of steps.
A time frame.
Yeah.
It's visual.
Right.
So to get to the next step, how do you submit a proposal to us?
Right.
Talking with Jack Grove, our attorney, said we have to interview 3
Right.
criteria architects and then choose one.
Choose one.
Based on, an interview. We,
Right.
have a
Right.
series of questions to ask, but then if we're gonna pay for this out of our funds without going, before we secure financing.
Right.
Or the bond, so is yours based on the amount of hours? Is
It basically is
like
based on the
basically an
amount of
hour?
hours, yeah.
Okay.
Because, and I have to judge how long it's gonna take to get what you need, get to the point of being able to develop that. It's not gonna take as long. I know with Goshen Township, to get to the point of being able to issue the criteria documents is around $46,000. Yours won't take that long because there's not as much involved, but it's not gonna be $15,000 either. I can tell you, it's supposed to be qualifications based, again, the state process. You interview 3, you make a selection based on qualifications, then you ask for a fee proposal.
Right.
There was a township tried to circumvent that. They asked for a fee. Can you give me an estimate of what your fee would be? So I gave them a range. There was another architect came in, gave them some sort of an estimate. They selected that firm based on fee, and 2 weeks later they called me and said, well, it was obvious when we started talking to that architect, they had never been a criteria architect. They didn't know what the scope of services were, and we went back in then and got hired to do the project. So it's
I know it's not fee-based,
right.
the decision's not based strictly on fee.
Yeah. What's interesting with this process, with KZF, we've got a lot of experience doing the design build criteria architect services. So we know what it takes to do that, and I know where we can make, and I make a lot of recommendations as we go on, go through in terms of what things like don't ask for a preliminary GMP. You're not going to get anybody to bid on it. I know that from experience. This project, and not to cut my or short sell myself, or what's the word I'm looking for? Just like the contractor doesn't necessarily have to have a whole lot of fire station experience, you could probably argue the same thing on the criteria architect side as well. But I will say that there are certain things with fire stations that I know that my competitor, who may not have designed a fire station, may not know. I know what a lot of different options are relative to designing a dormitory that we can put in there. I also know what the current codes require, tornado shelter. That's one of the things that's going to be interesting with this project is, with it being an addition, does it have to include a tornado shelter? That's one thing that would be one of the first phone calls I would make, is to sit down and with the, I assume Butler County is probably your plan building authority, to find out how they're going to interpret that. So there are things like that someone who hasn't done a fire station may not know that that's in the building code now and a requirement for a fire station. So there are a lot of things I can bring to the table in terms of different ways of designing dormitories and living spaces and toilet showers and things like that I think would be valuable for the chief as well as for the township.
Where are you based out of?
We're in Cincinnati,
Cincinnati.
downtown.
Okay.
Right now, I live in Westchester, so I've been
We
down
won't
here.
hold that against you.
So I'm in the county.
So basically, you get everything kind of ready for an architect to actually do the drawings.
Right, right.
In other words, ask them, this is what we want, this is what we need.
Yeah, and that's where, even for the, once they're selected, that's where the process can be shortened a little bit in the pre-construction phase on this as well. You're not going to be doing a lot of site work, basically, or digging footings to extend the building. There may be some rerouting of pavement around the building, but maybe not. There's already a septic system that's already been determined can support what you're putting in there. So that's going to help you not only from a budget standpoint, but also from a design standpoint. All you're doing is really designing the building. One thing I haven't talked about is, with a criteria architect, there's 3 phases of service. The state does not require, as I understand it currently, They require to have a criteria architect for phase one, and that's the process we just talked about, getting to the point where you've hired a design build team. At that point, the criteria architect can go away, and in fact, on Harlan Township, I was not involved beyond that step. Phase two is what we call pre-construction phase, and that's where the design builder is designing and coming up with the final construction documents for the building and going through the pricing with subs and establishing the GMP. That's the pre-construction phase. It's your option whether or not you maintain and continue with the criteria architect during that. And then phase three is the construction phase services where it's actually being built. And again, it's your option whether or not you continue and have the criteria architect on board for that. The only project where I have not been involved in that was the Harlan Township project. Again, it was basically 3 walls, a roof, and a floor slab, because they were simply extending the apparatus bays out. Contractor they hired was right there in the township. There was a lot of trust and familiarity there, so they weren't too concerned about quality. Every other project I've been involved in, they've continued with me on an hourly basis. Basically, I'm there when they need me to come in. I've sat in the review meetings as they went through the design just to make sure everything met the criteria documents. Again, that's your option. It's a fairly simple project. You may or may not need those services. So I always include that as an estimate for phase 2 and phase 3 to be billed on an hourly basis.
So Mark, just so I understand it as well, you can ethically or legally, whatever, you can bid on as one of the 3 or come back and interview as one of the 3 if you're doing the design or not?
No. As a criteria architect, and the state intentionally did that because you avoid a conflict of interest. And the other thing it does, and that's why I've continued on most of those projects as the owner's representative essentially, is to make sure that the documents and the design and ultimately the construction is in accordance with what the original criteria was.
So does the trustees have the option to go out for 3, interview 3 architect firms and then say, we're comfortable with KZF is to continue on through the rest of the scope of the project?
You're talking about for the phase
For
2 and
phase
3?
2,
Usually it's the same. It's just a continuation. I've only run into one situation. It was kind of an unusual situation where, and I think it was more personal issues between 1 or 2 trustees and the design builder that they ultimately hired, where they then brought in another architect. So they've actually, I'm continuing as criteria architect on behalf of the fire department more than anything else to make sure things get done the way they wanted it initially, but they've brought in another architect to help look for defects in the construction.
I just guess my feeling is just tonight, first hearing Brenda, then you, and now knowing Dwayne, I've got a comfortable feeling, and folks are in this process in the room today to see where it can go, continue on. You know, so,
Yeah.
okay.
And
If you
Go ahead.
continue on as a criteria architect after your proposal, initial proposal is accepted, how do you bill that, negotiate that to continue on as a representative through the build phase? Is that an hourly?
we do it
after that?
hourly typically, yes.
And then the second one is for the tornado shelter on the new code. Can that be a hardened above ground
Yeah.
facility,
Yes.
or does it have to be beneath grade?
No, it can be above grade. There's some options, and that's one of the things I've tried to figure out on this one of the ideal spaces to create the tornado shelter is a turnout gear room, because it's typically a hardened room. For a building of this size, it only has to occupy occupy the people who are actually living in the station, because you would probably only have, how many dorms were you looking at?
There'd be 5.
5. So worst
There's
case,
4 to 5 people.
yeah. So worst case, you look at it on a shift change, you got maybe 10 people in there. You're under a certain level. In fact, the threshold is really 50. As long as you're under 50, there are a lot of things, you don't have to put light fixtures in for a tornado shelter. You just have flashlights in that room. You don't necessarily have to put a toilet in there. You don't have to put a sink in there.
But a
So
lot of times it is the restroom in the center of the.
you can do that. And that's one of the areas I think for your station that might have to be looked at, because it's, I think it's what, 5 square foot per person. You're only in there for 2 hours. It's not like a hurricane shutter where it's gotta be 24 or 48 hours, I forget what it is. So there are ways of doing it. On a project like this, it may actually be less expensive to look at doing some sort of a in-ground type tornado shelter. That's another way you can do that. But with fire stations right now, it's pretty typical to look at one of the support spaces off the apparatus space, because those are typically masonry construction. Even if it's post frame, a lot of times it's masonry construction. With this one, since we're building basically just residential housing and office facilities, which would typically be wood or metal stud partitions, it may take a little more creativity to figure out the best way to incorporate that, if it is required. My gut feeling is it's going to be required. Typically with an addition like this, you have to bring the whole building up to code. Either that or you're building a firewall to separate the building. So there's some code things we would have to look at right off the bat on this project to make sure we've got it incorporated.
Okay.
But yeah, it's an intriguing project. It's a small project, but there are some nuances of it that I think are pretty interesting to try to solve. The fact that you're extending the building, depending on what the size and what our code requirements are, you may have to separate that by fire. There's a challenge there because you're hoping to extend a day room through that wall. So there are some things that have to be thought about right off the bat. And we have to think about that, even though we're not designing it, we need to have some knowledge of what the limitations are and what the code ramifications are, so we can get that incorporated into the criteria documents. So, I know there's a lot of stuff
There's
there,
a lot
and,
to think about.
and you did. I was hearing August, and I'm thinking I'm not sure that's going to work, but I'd work with you to get you. I'd get you started as early as I can.
Okay.
I'll assure you that.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, thank you
All
very
right.
much.
Is it Dwayne now? You bringing up? Dwayne?
Okay, so Dwayne, Accurate Carpentry. I'll just give him a quick intro. As Mark kind of alluded, you feel real comfortable with a contractor you've worked with before, and kind of like a mechanic. So in 2010, Dwayne, I was thrown into here's the old ag building, which is now the EOC and the dispatch center. Here's the ag building, turn it into an EOC and a dispatch center, and here's X amount of dollars. We found Dwayne. I'm not even sure how the process was that we got Dwayne. He came in, did the entire renovation project. Just an exceptional working relationship that I had with Dwayne on this project that just built a confidence and a comfortable level with me working with Dwayne. We had our little incident with the building last year, and I called Dwayne, and within, I think, 24 hours, he was out the next day shoring the building back up. That's kind of the trust I have with Dwayne. So I know talking to Dwayne, he's done an addition, I think, in Indian Hills, Madera, and I'm going to let him talk about that and some of his other projects he's done. But I will say thank you to Dwayne. He's come out for probably a year or more and worked with us going up first, which we figured that couldn't happen. Kind of got into that IP mess that we appreciate Dwayne kind of bringing to our attention that we were getting screwed, any better term, and bringing that to us to the point of today's the day to kind of officially meet Dwayne. We kind of had our communications crossed 2 weeks ago to say, feel Dwayne out. Here's some of the things he said. He's already done, like I said, the grade for the septic tank and some stuff already preliminary on it. To introduce Dwayne today, kind of give him a little bio on him, and then have you guys start to ask some questions on him. Introduced Marty and Mark to get kind of that building relationship there and that design build thing. And thanks to Mark, because he sent me this document about that thick, and I didn't understand design build, design build, and all that. So hearing Mark today explain that was a immense help to me as well in that process. I can put a fire out, but I can't build a building. So with that, Dwayne, come on up and introduce yourself and everything about you that I kind of already know.
Hi, I'm Dwayne Hacker, Accurate Carpentry. My wife and I started our business, I'm going to say around 2006. I've been a carpenter basically my whole life. My parents had friends who were union carpenters, and they were always building things. And as a kid, I was just kind of following those guys around and just kind of was a journeyman for them for a long time, going and picking up tools and everything, and really liked it. And that's why we started our business. Was it 2010, really?
I think it was 2010, because I came in 9, they said, here's $250,000 grant, remodel this building.
It was actually through the paper. It was a bid through the paper.
Okay.
So we interviewed for that and started working then, and we are still working to this day for the 911 center. Occasionally, Matt Franke will call up and they'll need something done, and we go over there and do whatever they need. But we worked on the Madeira Firehouse. I think that was 2015-16. And then we did the Indian Hill Firehouse, which was 16-17. We did framing. We did all the fiber cement on the outside of both of the buildings. And we did some framing also on the Madeira one, but those were complete new builds. We didn't frame the entire buildings. We just did what we needed to do for our work, which was installing the fiber cement. At the Madeira building, it was kind of complicated. They wanted the fiber cement panels, which are 4x8 sheets, and in some cases 4x10 sheets. They range anywhere from 60 to 80 pounds a piece, and they wanted those stuck up underneath the overhang, and they actually had it designed with steel studs, and we had to go in and say there's just no way that we can fasten this and make it work, and we had to actually reframe it with wood, the fireproof studs, in order to make that work. Anyway, we did work with JTF Construction on those 2 projects, and if we do have to go with the design build thing, I didn't know half of what he was telling me there about having to have a design build, but we worked with JTF Construction, and they were the lead contractor on both of those jobs. So I can contact them and reach out to them, and actually I just did. I sent them a text to see if they have an architect on hand to do that part of it. At that point, I would just be a subcontractor for them, and if that's the way that it goes, that's fine. Any other questions for me?
There's no fire suppression requirement in the design, is there?
Probably not. That's where it gets a little, because you don't have, I don't even have water out here.
We have city water, the old existing building does not.
Right.
And I know Oxford just maybe 2 years ago built their addition, and somehow they got pretty much the same mix that we have. A training room on the first floor, bathroom, the living quarters, the 2 bedrooms are upstairs, and somehow around it they did not have to put sprinkler systems in that addition either. And so, and I will go back and kind of relay what Mark said on that building. And I know I'm on tape and all, but they'll admit it as well. They used a residential builder for that, and they're just having horrendous problems with that building because they didn't reach out to commercial folks or something like that. They just use a guy that just frames houses, and that thing is literally sinking and falling in spots already, so.
Relative to this building, it depends on what the size of the building is to ultimate expansion, and whether or not with the open perimeter you can build that full building and still meet the code as a non-suppressed building. I mentioned Bloom Township before, and that station was designed with the ability to, I think, actually add 1 or 2 bays and still not sprinkle, because they have no water out there, they're on a well. But it
Dwayne, you have the full capabilities if you would be the contractor to select to do the complete job from footers to the roof and everything that would be involved? Would that be within your scope of work?
There would be certain things that we would sub out. And we had talked about, you have a concrete person that you were comfortable with?
The guy that did our pads out front.
D&W.
The brick folks that Dwayne, we worked with to re-brick the corner of the building, so. Now, on the original IP for upstairs, Dwayne brought in his HVAC, electrical, plumbing, and his folks in on that original going up phase.
Yeah, HVAC, electrical, roofing, plumbing. We wouldn't do the drywall. We would be subbing that out, but yeah.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Dwayne's from Wayne Township, so he's another Butler County resident.
Yes.
North end of the county, Wayne. But again, I'll go back to what I kind of had alluded to just a moment ago, is just that trust factor that I've worked with Wayne before, and knowing that, and then the time Mark has given, coming up here and talking in numerous emails, trust factor already there with both of those two.
So are
You
you,
can see, you can understand on Brenda's part, thank God she explained it today again, because I couldn't write the notes fast enough for this informative information that she had, so again, thanks to Brenda today for coming to explain that.
are you more of a family, or are you a larger business, smaller,
Smaller.
small?
Yeah, I've got 4 crews, and then my main crew that's with me all the time, it bounces anywhere from 5 to 8 people on my main crew, but our other crews are probably 4-man crews, and we keep at least 3 or 4 of them. And then our sub crews, like the plumbers and things, I can't speak for them. Maybe they have 2 or 3 guys, but yeah.
All right, thanks, Dwayne.
Thank you.
I guess I would say in closing today is we got a lot of information today. I think from Brenda on the bond process, and I kind of understand that more now on that process and how we go about those processes. Mark, again, as I said a little earlier, explained that design build factor, which gives us a little bit more leeway of picking a contractor, because we all have been through low bid and know what low bid gets you as well. So with that being said, I guess we'll kind of talk at a later date, the 3 of us, of what we heard today. But again, I want to thank both Brenda, Mark, and Dwayne for coming here, because I think I've learned in an hour and a half a whole lot more information than I knew an hour and a half ago about this process. And it's gotten way out of my swim lane as a fire chief to know about building a building and the addition. But, as I've said before, and I said this to Mark the day that he came up, we're looking to build for the next 25 to 30 years with that addition as we grow, and not, build something for next year as we plan to grow out at this building and grow out in a larger format for expansion. So again, trustees, thank you. I appreciate the coming in for the workshop, and that's all I have, unless you have questions for me.
I got just one more.
Absolutely.
And this to Brenda. Brenda, after you've heard Mark and Dwayne, is there anything you'd like to add after you've heard these 2 gentlemen kind of reveal the architect and the build process that had come to mind?
No, I mean, other than might not need money as quickly as
Yeah.
as LCMD thinks you do, so you might need a follow-up call to Brad at LCMD saying that it'll take a little bit longer before you're actually ready to issue the bond than is possible.
Okay.
Yeah, and then we work with Jack Grove, so he can help you through. He says your attorney, he needs the Jack attorney, not the bond attorney.
Yes, understood.
Yep. Yep. And
The construction piece of
Okay.
that.
And I believe in the emails, Jack Grove spoke highly of KZF Designs and had worked with them before and spoke highly of them. And I forgot to mention in the audience again tonight, Lenora is here also from LCMB Bank. She helped really start this funding project and mechanism for us a couple of months ago and when we started talking about this. So thanks, Lenora, for starting that process through LCMB as well. So
Chief, you got quite a network spread out.
I tell you,
Commend you.
I when I find good people and I try and keep them close, exactly. So you get a bond and you have a trust bond you build, and I appreciate it. So thank you, appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll second that. Oh, I'll make a motion to adjourn.
Second?
Mr. Brucker?
Yes.
Mr. Kolb?
Yes.
Mr. Updike?
Yes.
We are adjourned.